since dynorphins are general, and this dynorphin response is general, there are plenty of other things that in a person's life that can also trigger it. Anything they're unwilling to experience, anything that would be mortifying to them. The essence of what makes it mortifying is the dynorphin tag that thing has. So the greater the dynorphin tag associated with the experience, the more mortifying it is. That's why it's so transformative for people to learn to willingly lean into the dynorphins.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at optimwork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at optimwork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the Optimal Work Podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Hey, Kevin, good to be back.
Hey, Sharif, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Kevin. Well, I have a feeling this episode is going to be particularly painful for us today to record, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. You wanted to discuss dynorphins.
That's right. The dynorphins, I believe, are the shortcut to growth. And being able to directly embrace them is crucial, and that we learn how to train ourselves how to do that.
Yeah. And maybe just to introduce the topic a little bit, and I mentor people, college students a lot, and sometimes they get they'll show up at a mentoring session and they'll be a little bit down on themselves that, they are procrastinating more often or get more, waste time more on social media or something. And so they seem to like there's an unwillingness to like engage the challenges in work that they're feeling. And they think, well, I'm not progressing because I have this unwillingness. I feel it. So they get kind of disappointed with themselves, thinking that they're not making the progress that they should be making. But one of the messages I think of this episode is, hey, when you have that unwillingness, that's like gold. So you want to look for that and take advantage of it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but no matter how much you grow, there's always going to be some unwillingness to take on some challenges, right?
There always has to be some discomfort in growth. So no ideal becomes a reality without sacrifice, without some kind of discomfort that you're deliberately embracing for the sake of the good. And then the good that you're aiming to attain makes the entire discomfort good as well. And so that's a very deep transformation. But you're getting to this point of unwillingness. And understanding unwillingness took CBT like 50 years. So it took a long time, because you can actually summarize it in one question. So let's say I get really angry and I throw a plate against the wall and shatter it.
Yeah, I've actually seen you do that before.
Exactly, in the restaurant one time.
Yeah.
So, did I throw the plate against the wall because I'm angry? Or did I throw the plate against the wall because I don't want to be angry? That question then divided the camps of CBT into two. So the earlier forms of CBT were all looking at basically how do you regulate emotion? All right, so what can you do to help people when they have a strong emotion not act on it? The implication being that we act on emotions because they're there and because they're strong. So then we have to decrease the emotion. What ends up happening is it turns the emotion itself into a defeat. You already feel defeated when you have this really powerful emotion. And so that's discouraging. So what the newer forms of CBT do that kind of flip it on its head, especially acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is really puts the finger on this. The unwillingness is what drives acting on emotion. You only act on an emotion that you're unwilling to have. If you're totally, if you were willing to let the mosquito bite your arm, it would just, not that that's a good thing, but you wouldn't swat it. Or if you're willing to let the subsequent itch simply be there, you wouldn't scratch it. So all the emotions have this nature of being a kind of appetite, right? They want something. This goes back to Aristotle. And that very fact that they want something means that we act to satisfy them, which means we act to make them go away, which means we act on them because we're unwilling to have them. If you're perfectly willing to suffer the craving for the cookie, you don't eat the cookie. But the more you're unwilling to experience that craving, well, the more you end up eating the cookie.
Well, okay. So was this posed? I'm just kind of curious about the history of the thing. Was this posed explicitly as a question, and then people answered it differently, or was it just kind of assumed that, yeah, of course? I mean, because it's a subtle point, and it seems like maybe it was just a later development that people thought maybe this is how it works, as opposed to, or were there really, like two camps all along, as you said?
Well, what happened was the introduction of mindfulness into the CBT universe led therapists to the discovery that when people could be just simply aware of a present experience and stay with it, then they actually didn't give in. They didn't take any steps to alter the experience or to decrease the experience. And so, or to try to prevent the experience. So this is what gave rise directly to therapists getting used to the idea of experiential avoidance drives all maladaptive coping. So the wanting to avoid a particular experience is what leads actually to bad habits. So whatever the bad habit might be. And so that, so Steve Hayes talked about that in the 2012 book, the textbook on acceptance and commitment therapy. And he talks about how the experiential avoidance is the phenomenon that occurs when a person is unwilling to remain with some kind of private experience. It could be a thought, a feeling, a memory, a bodily sensation, something that they're unwilling to have. And then that actually drives them to take steps to alter it in some way. So you could see then that like the core of it actually is they're unwilling to simply be with whatever is in reality right now. So that unwillingness to accept reality is what drives these behaviors.
Yeah. So then it seems natural to use some kind of exposure therapy where you actually help people to experience whatever the emotion is without acting on it, because they have to be kind of exposed to it and trained to see like, okay, this is how I fully feel it, and to be mindful of it as it's present. Is that like the essential insight that led to the development of exposure therapy, or did exposure therapy predate this kind of shift?
Yeah, so exposure therapy goes back to the very first wave of CBT, which is about operant conditioning and classic conditioning. And so that is where they learn that if you repeatedly expose someone to the thing that they're afraid of, then the fear response does go down, as long as nothing bad happens while they're exposed to it. And so there's all this talk about, which now gives you a headache to read, but about conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus and repetitions. So, but the whole goal of exposure therapy in the first and second wave of CBT, and the distinction here doesn't matter, is that it was actually to make the anxiety go away. So that means it's really about being unwilling to have anxiety. And in a way, that's kind of what set up the whole idea of therapy. So we go to therapy to make some emotion that we're suffering stop. And in ACT, the purpose of exposure is actually to teach people how to willingly have the emotion, which is a much more sophisticated and deep kind of learning. So we can go a little more into that. But ACT has this idea that any kind of pain is not the same as suffering. You can have pain and not be suffering at all. The way ACT sees it, basically suffering is pain plus unwillingness to have the pain. That is what causes real suffering. So to simply have something that you don't want to experience, as long as you're like willing for it to be there, you actually don't really notice it. So there are these there are these ways that we can look at how unwillingness to experience a discomfort or a pain or an emotion like anxiety, that unwillingness, and there's at least 3 reasons that it intensifies the experience and makes it worse. And the first is that simply anything you're unwilling to experience, well, you will experience more of it. Your brain knows that you don't want this experience. And so whenever it's showing up, your brain really like amplifies it for you. That's called thalamic gating. And what it means is that the awareness of the discomfort becomes more repetitive and intrusive. So that's why you have repetitive, intrusive thoughts with things like worrying and obsessing or ruminating. But it means that there's some discomfort there you're unwilling to have. And so whenever it starts to come up, boom, it takes over your whole awareness. Your thalamus opens up the gate so that it takes up more of your conscious experience. So that's always there.
This is related to the negative processing bias where
Exactly.
The more you complain about something, the more you start to see the negative in things.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And then, but there's also this other part of it, which is like the second reason that you get suffering when you're unwilling to have pain, is that you have these then secondary emotions that are responding to whatever the first thing was. So let's say that someone hates being angry, but keeps having anger outbursts. Okay, so what's likely happening is one, whenever there's something that would provoke their anger, that gets amplified. So it takes up more of their attention, it's more intrusive. But then 2, they actually get angry at being angry. And so that very fact then amplifies the anger and makes it worse. So someone could be, or you could be angry at feeling sad. So the sadness triggers it. So it could be that you're anxious about getting more anxious. That's like the essence in all anxiety disorders. That there's always this dread of the anxiety or the thing coming back. But then now you're anxious about being anxious, so you have more anxiety. It amplifies it. So whether it's the same exact emotion or a different one, you have these secondary emotions on top of the first one. So that means if your primary pain is some feeling, some emotion that you don't want to have, then you have these 2 ways it's going to get amplified. One is thalamic gating, you're just more aware of it, and the other is that it triggers the emotion itself. But then there's this third part, which we can get into in a moment, which is this neurochemical impact of being stuck with some pain. Being stuck in a state of thwarted escape, where you're wishing you could get away from this thing and you can't. And that is what adds on this layer of suffering that makes it feel intolerable. And that's what dynorphins do. You actually recruit, so the unwillingness to feel something or experience something recruits dynorphins to that thing. Now they're tagged with dynorphins. So whenever then they occur, not only is it amplified, not only does it cause other emotions, but also then this intolerable feeling sits on top of it. And in ACT, that's seen as that's the real cause of suffering. So much so that say you take a person who has panic attacks, how much of their suffering is caused by the attacks themselves versus all of the dread they have about further attacks coming? Like essentially all of the unwillingness they have to have those attacks in their life. It's like 5% to 95%. The actual panic attacks are tiny. Sometimes people have only had 1 or 2, and yet their life is dominated by the fear of it. So I think that it's interesting to see this idea of the pie chart, like how much of the suffering is caused by the primary pain versus how much of it is actually amplified by unwillingness.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Kevin, let me ask you some questions here about this. So you mentioned that we have these emotions and then perhaps secondary emotions too as well. And then there's also this thing of the neurochemical reaction, the dynorphins that are released in this when we feel the event or when we experience the event or feel the emotion. its own emotion, like that we would call frustration, or I guess feeling thwarted or something? Or would you identify that with one of those emotions that was in the earlier stage?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. This I've never seen addressed in the literature on dynorphins, but dynorphins are completely tied to thwarted escape and learned helplessness. And so that's, in fact, how we learned a lot about how these things work. That basically, if you just block dynorphins, you give these antagonists that don't let or you have knockout mice that have no prodynorphin, the thing that makes dynorphin. They actually don't have learned helplessness, at least not nearly to the extent you see in normal mice. Which means then that learned helplessness is like the normal model in animals of chronic stress or depression. So that there's this chronic, highly stressed state that is produced where they kind of then give up eventually, or animals stop trying to avoid shocks. Turns out that's actually, in some way, all mediated by dynorphins. So what we know is that dynorphins are just hugely important in thwarted escape and inescapable stressors. But in humans, that means really anything that we're stuck with. So thwarted escape doesn't have to just apply to like getting stuck on a balcony, with the door locked. That's my usual example of thwarted escape. It could be the sound of your roommates chewing, which keeps coming up, or I was just at a restaurant and the guy at the table next to us was blowing his nose and leaving the handkerchiefs on the table right there. So I felt a little bit of thwarted escape, but because dynorphins were on my mind, I tried to embrace it. So it doesn't have to be. So it does seem like, especially when there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, when it's frustrating. But I think the best description is that it's especially the intolerable aspect of it. Frustration itself may be an emotion, but when it feels intolerable, then that's the dynorphins laid on top. So we actually learned to help people to separate what is the actual the actual pain versus what is all that they're suffering because of unwillingness, which in fact that's where you locate the dynorphins. That's a huge thing to learn to separate. And only the most recent forms of CBT try to do that separation. But it ends up being hugely important.
That's great. So one question that might be a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's so interesting to see the relationship between the neurochemical, neurological dimension, the neuroscience, and then, the very physical, and then also the psychological, the more, emotional or mental thing. So it seems like with dynorphins are kind of paired with unwillingness. And unwillingness I see as like, okay, you don't have a motivation, you don't have a reason. I know you don't like the word motivation, but I would see that, someone has unwillingness when they don't have a good reason to experience something. So if you don't have a reason to experience pain, it's an unwillingness and you're going to experience it as suffering. And then sometimes dopamine is kind of like the molecule of motivation. So if you have dynorphins are related to unwillingness, which is like the opposite of being motivated and willingness, and that's connected to dopamine. Would you see dopamine and dynorphins as being opposite, or am I just like mixing up all these categories?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Now, technically, the real opposite of dynorphins are called endorphins. And so dynorphins are they're a particular molecule, a particular form of opioids. So there's like dynorphin A, dynorphin B, and other things like that. So these bind to special opioid receptors called kappa opioid receptors. And so those are spread throughout the brain in all the most interesting regions, in the amygdala, in the prefrontal cortex, in your hypothalamus, which controls how stressable and reactive you are and how your heart rate and how your threat mode turns on. And in your reward centers. So dynorphins are all over the place in very interesting places. Endorphins are a different kind of opioid molecule that goes to a different receptor called mu-opioid receptors. And those are associated with good mood, even euphoria. So in that sense, dynorphins produce dysphoria and endorphins produce euphoria. But we also know, and this is where you're exactly right, that dopamine and endorphins just go together. And what triggers one triggers the other. And so that you're right, these are opposites. And maybe it's outside the scope of this episode, but that's the basis of what's called opponent process theory. So which is super important.
Right. We've done an episode on that in the past, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe even a series. Awesome. So I guess, then the follow-up question is to start to get into, you mentioned dynorphin A, dynorphin B. So I guess, is there a difference in dynorphins, chemically or in this feeling of this intolerable frustration and unwillingness about, circumstance A versus circumstance B versus emotion A, so is there like a difference, or how should we approach dynorphins in these different areas or associate with these different emotions?
Yeah, you don't have different dynorphins for different areas. So they all are involved in the one dynorphin response, which is good, at least as far as we know now, and that makes it kind of more clear. What's clear is that dynorphins are what drive all maladaptive coping behaviors. So that's held as a pretty well-proven thing now, particularly the key driver, for instance, of how vulnerable a person is to addiction. Addiction being a nice example of maladaptive coping. So because when people are stressed, they're more likely to engage in addictive things. So that's a very clear thing. But in fact, this makes sense, that every bad habit that people can have is actually a way of coping with something painful. And so there's a pain, a species of pain, that triggers a person's dynorphin response. And different kinds of pain trigger the same dynorphin response, but then you get these different coping strategies. And that's what creates vicious cycles. So the more we are unwilling to experience something, the greater the dynorphin response associated with it, and the more likely we're going to use some kind of coping behaviors. So you could go through and look at different types of coping behaviors and see these are all the result of a person being unwilling to experience a particular kind of pain.
Yeah. So Kevin, how would you apply this knowledge in, say, your mentoring if you're trying to help people? I guess we discussed earlier at the beginning of the episode that basically there's always some form of unwillingness. There's always some discomfort involved with growth. So if you're meeting with someone and trying to help them, even if they're already pretty successful, then you're looking for where's the growth, which is always where's the discomfort, where's it going to be, where's the unwillingness, where are the dynorphins. So how do you go about putting all this together into like a plan to help this specific person in these circumstances grow?
Yeah, exactly. So my experience has been that if you're not identifying the particular discomfort that they're most unwilling to have, you end up not being able to cause profound behavioral change. So if you're dealing with someone who uses escapism, let's say, and so they have addictive behaviors or they use substances, you have to stop and it's not just about problem solving those behaviors, and so it's not just about preventing the behaviors from occurring in some kind of purely behavioral way. You have to get to what is the discomfort that actually is driving it. And then you can see actually where you have a lot more room for change. That there's oftentimes one particular emotion that is overwhelming for them, or that stresses them out, or is simply feeling overwhelmed. That whenever they feel overwhelmed, not in every circumstance, there's always something specific about a situation. So it's when they're in this particular situation, in order to avoid a particular pain, that's why they engage in escapism. So you have to kind of learn to dissect it, So you first see where are the situations where it occurs, and then, okay, then what at that moment, right before you did it, what was the thing, the discomfort you were experiencing? That discomfort then is going to be the goal. That's what they learn to welcome. If they can be willing to experience that, and we can talk about what willingness means later, but if they can be willing to experience it, you actually then can cause a profound change. And so that's just one example. Let's say with a person who's procrastinating. So they just may see themselves as a procrastinator. But you ask yourself, well, they're probably not always procrastinating. It's not that everything in their life is put off. There's particular kinds of stressors. Maybe it's on a difficult project where they know their performance will be judged. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a window then, so that they can start to see, okay, what is the discomfort? Is it the potential criticism that they're afraid of? Or is it simply the effort of getting started? So that when it's a really complicated project, is it the feeling of uncertainty? Now, the particular kind of skills you want them to build, like say breaking down the first step into smaller steps, that's just the setting. That's going to be the actual concrete plan, but you have to include the willingness to feel and welcome the discomfort that will be accompanying that. Otherwise, the unwillingness is going to kick in again, and they won't use that new skill.
Is this willingness like a general habit? And I guess, one thing that's gotten very popular these days is cold plunges.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say, who likes them, but so if I just get really good at, say, cold plunges, is that going to help me just build, the general habit of willingness to experience discomfort, and then I'll be, better at overcoming procrastination, better at experiencing shame, all these types of things. Is that what you say, or is there like a specific unwillingness that you have to develop for each type of pain?
Yeah, so this is the good news. Since dynorphins are general, and this dynorphin response is general, there are plenty of other things that in a person's life that can also trigger it. Anything they're unwilling to experience, anything that would be mortifying to them. The essence of what makes it mortifying is the dynorphin tag that thing has. So, and the greater the dynorphin tag associated with the experience, the more mortifying it is. So that's why it's so transformative for people to learn to willingly lean into the dynorphins. And yes, it could be a cold plunge. It could be a cold shower. It could be a sauna. It could be exercising itself, just physical exercise. It could be fasting or abstaining from meat for a time or from a favorite food. So any of these practices that involve some kind of deliberate sacrifice that you are voluntarily doing can become a practice then to willingly lean into dynorphins. And I think there are 3 stages here. The first is practicing welcoming it. So you simply flip the unwillingness that's there by rote into a willingness to be present with the feeling. The second is to savor it more, to let yourself notice everything about it, and this only takes 2 seconds. It's a very brief thing. And the third, and the height of it, is to actually find a way to put love into it. Love is the height of willingness. So if you can love something, at least because in some way it's helping you to attain some good. It might not be that in itself it's lovable, but there's good you can attain or obtain through it. And that makes it in some way lovable. So there's this. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, I think there's a very deep wisdom. I actually read it in John the Cross, which is where there is no love, something you hate, put in love and you draw out love. And to me, that's really the height of dynorphin training. Learning to pass love through these experiences that, yes, mortify us. These are things that we don't like or are unwilling. Not things that are unhealthy for us or that are dangerous, but little practices of self-denial. I mean, Some of this is just built into life. If a parent is being woken up, I was just talking to someone at lunch, and someone they're being woken up through the night. Well, it's natural that we're unwilling to be woken up repeatedly because of a baby. But at the same time, that can be something that you willingly embrace out of love for the child. And that's an example then where you're not happy, but you welcome it. You let yourself feel the unwillingness as it melts away, and then you put love into it. That's I think exactly the template.
Yeah. Good. Well, hey, Kevin, we're basically out of time here. So
all right. Time flies here, Sharif. Thanks for the questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your answers.
Great. Until next time.
All right. We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out optimwork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.